from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to this podcast on flipped supervisory training, a very odd title for a rather special approach to thinking about doctoral supervision. There's been a lot of talk, if not much action and theorising, on the flipped classroom in the last 8 to 10 years. At Flinders, though, I decided to apply this theorisation of the flip to flipped supervisory training. I've been using this model for ongoing professional development as well. So my first 60 plus new PhD supervisors have been added to the register, the supervisory register, on the basis of this method. So one of the people that I have trained through this PhD supervisory training is a gentleman by the name of Professor Steve Redhead, who I know via an accident of marriage. So it's actually great to apply a new way of thinking about training, supervisory training, knowing that one person that's being trained, I can ask directly about how effective it was or otherwise, and he has to tell me the truth or else I won't feed him. So I wanted to talk about the success, or indeed otherwise, of this approach, this flipping of supervisory training and its potential for ongoing professional development in the PhD space. So good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Tara.
And isn't it interesting that you were my student?
I was Brabazon, or trained, as you say.
You were Brabazon. Yes, you were, but the good news is you can actually tell the truth, because this is about providing a model around the world for new ways of thinking about supervision. So I give you permission to tell the truth, and where I've stuffed up, you can always tell me, and that's never been your problem in the past. So, Steve, why do you think that so many academics are recalcitrant, if you like, to engage in training, particularly in the supervisory space? What's going on? Is it simply time poverty, or is it something else?
I think it could be time poverty, but I think it's probably something else. I mean, I was definitely recalcitrant in various parts of my career, especially, I think, with when you get to be a PhD supervisor, and I've done 33 completions now, but
and we've got a lot about to be completed.
Absolutely, yeah, and a number of current ones. But I think at various stages in my career, I have been a resistor to the idea of training and the practice of training. But actually, I've learned a great deal, and it's helped me to develop my own supervision. But I can only really say that now. Looking back on it, I definitely was resistant. I can understand why people are resistant, partly because if you get to be a PhD supervisor, and certainly one of experience, then you're probably going to be in a position of authority, you know, an assistant dean or whatever it is.
Yes.
So you get to a point where you think, I really should be training people rather than being trained. And I think that's part of what it is. But actually, I've learnt so much. I mean, in the current training, which I've now finished at Flinders, I learned a great deal. But maybe that's partly because I've been more open to those sorts of practices.
Can I say, Steve, the other problem with being a very experienced supervisor, of which we both are, is you can also become very set in your ways. So one of the problems of going, I'm very experienced, leave me alone, is if you've got a tick, and I'm using that intentionally, a tick in your supervisory practice that may be causing problems, you haven't got the self-efficacy or the reflection to realise that maybe there are other ways of doing things. Is that true as well?
I think so, yes. Yes, definitely. So you're not really reflexive, you're not looking... I certainly have experience that, you're not reflexive, you know what you're doing, you almost become arrogant about it, and what you really should do is leave room for reflexivity and to try and change things if necessary, but also to review the way you do things, and particularly, with digitisation being so important in social media and so on, being so important in supervisory training now, you have to retrain, you have to relearn, I think.
And I was thinking one of the reasons you're so innovative and still producing fantastic connected up teaching and research, which is so important for supervision, is because you're prepared to say, right, well, let me do a gig and learn about Twitter. Let me learn about best use of PowerPoint. Let's really keep all this energy going on, best use of sonic media, and challenge yourself to think about assessment and technology and teaching and learning in new ways.
And I think that partly came from actually listening to new supervisors, you know, people who have not supervised very much, but they were bringing fresh perspectives. In some cases, things I didn't necessarily agree with, but fresh perspectives which made me rethink my own practice.
Indeed. We'll start at the other end, if you like. We've got the innovation and the excitement and the dynamism of the best of teaching and learning and the best of andragogy, really. But why does compliance matter so much in terms of supervisory training? So, you know, most universities demand, in fact, that if you're going to supervise, you know what, you have to do these particular training things. You have to go through these hoops, if you will. You don't want a ticker box thing, but you are doing that. Why is this space so invested in compliance, do you think?
Well, I think it's back to what I was saying before about people's stick in the mudness. You know, if you didn't have the compliance, they wouldn't do it.
No.
And in fact, you know, it's really a matter of this is good for you. You should do it. And I think that's
like brand for your brand.
Yeah. That's why compliance is so important.
But also, I mean, it is that challenge, isn't it? And we see them a lot. We've seen them around the world where almost abuse narratives take place in the supervisory space, where someone puffs himself up and goes, "I'm a terribly experienced supervisor. Look at me, look at me, look at me."
And you can't tell me anything.
And you can't tell me anything. And of course, we can see by completion rates and completion speed, which are often proxies for problems, that something is going on. But of course, because you respect supervisors, you can't necessarily diagnose what's going on. So you've just got to hope for the best, do a bit of training and see if they are of fluid mind, where they at least can realise something is occurring which is new and innovative, and they might learn something.
Yes, and also I think you're learning, when we're talking about compliance, you're also learning regulations and regulation, which you wouldn't do otherwise. You kind of ignore it.
Yeah, and the trouble is a lot of people go, "Oh, regulation's dull, regulation's boring, policy boring, procedures boring." What did one of our colleagues formerly call this? Administrivia. But actually, I find that quite an offensive thing to say, to be frank with you, because I'm in favour of governance.
So am I.
As I often say, Steve, you've heard me say it, we are paid by the public purse. We've got students' lives in our hands. So a bit of compliance to ensure a governance and a regulatory environment can ensure that we're spending public money carefully, effectively, and with respect.
Yes, and I think particularly at PhD level, you know, people's knowledge of actually what the specific university regulations are in this area is very, very poor.
Yeah.
So again, the idea of compliance means that they are actually learning about those regulations probably for the first time.
And also internationalisation and globalisation in its many manifestations is important here, because if someone has been at a university for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they've become very used to what is happening in a single place. And now, as particularly PhD education has been globalised and globalising Bologna on, you can't manage what you did at Murdoch for 10, 15, 20 years, or what you did at Sydney for 10, 20, 50 years, or Waikato or Manchester. That's over.
I think so.
Very powerful. Steve, you had to suffer me doing 2 core modules for supervisory training, and we had a whole series. About 3/4 of the group that we trained, so about 40 out of the 60, had never supervised before, so that's great. They were brand new supervisors, postdoc, if you will. And then we had you there, and you were fantastic too. You were very intellectually generous to the new supervisors, but you actually provided a great opportunity for me to work out what's going on and if it's working, and you would tell the truth. So what this model involved is, for the 2 core modules, before you went into the session, you would watch a video that's on YouTube, completely at your time and disposal to watch, as efficient as possible. I think one of the videos was 30 minutes and the others were much less than that.
That you had prepared.
That I had prepared. And also, if you couldn't stand the video, and I understand that, you also had a podcast, so you could listen to it in the car, listen to it while you're going for a walk, listen to it while you're exercising. So you would do that, if you like, content-based material in your own time, in your own space, and then come to a 1-hour workshop where you would apply that material through a whole series of case studies. I configured a whole series of scenarios of real life strategies and then asked the group to work through that scenario. So and I delivered it, so tell listeners, if you can, Steve, what that was like because you'd never done that before either.
No, I hadn't.
What did you think of that as a model, as a method, as a strategy?
I thought it was really good, and I'm comparing it to previous universities where I had undergone some aspect of training like this, and it was certainly way better than those. But also I think that use of social media, using podcasts, which are so accessible in your own time, was a great idea, so that in fact you were, and I noticed that all of the people I was being trained with had listened or watched, you're actually accessing the lecture, if you like, the main information. And when you got there, you discussed. You really did. I was amazed that so much discussion was going on in a relatively short time, and people had based their ideas not only on their own experience, but actually what they'd been watching. So I thought it was really of a high intellectual level because the podcasts and podcasts have been accessed first.
See, that's really powerful too, because you and I talk about this a lot. One of the great challenges in the doctoral education space is the notion of experience, and it causes us huge amounts of problems, if you will. So this was my experience of a PhD at Monash in 1985. This is my experience of a PhD at Manchester in 1978. And look, you wouldn't have any scientific method that would take one case study and generalise it. And similarly, there was a supervisor. I've supervised 10 people, I've supervised 50 people, and you still can't generalise beyond a very narrow parameter and discipline. So moving people beyond experience and into expertise is very challenging in this space.
It is, and the thing is, it's a classic empiricism.
It is.
I have experienced this, and therefore it's a scientific truth. And I know myself, you get into that kind of discourse, but as a theoreticist rather than an empiricist, I would insist on the idea of learning first. Experience is useful in these sorts of things, and the actual discussion that went on in those training sessions was often based on people saying, well, when I was a student.
Yeah.
So you're right. But also, some of the people who were new supervisors, they also talked about, when I started to be a supervisor.
Yeah.
All very useful experience, but it has to be framed. And I think that's the difficulty. Maybe that is one of the difficulties in the way in which people are trained. You need so much more access to academic work on the PhD, really.
Yes.
Rather than I experienced this in 2000 at Murdoch University or whatever.
Exactly. So we've already talked about what you think are some of the strengths of the flipped model. So in other words, people had, if you like, done some homework and were coming with expertise and an open brain, ready to experience something new, and that's great. So that's a great strength of the flipped model. Can you think of any other strengths and indeed the weaknesses or challenges of this model of supervisory training going forward to further PD as well?
Yes, I think it is the one that I've referred to really, which is the learning and the access to such a great body of work, basically, and you can access that through social media. But the actual learning about how you train people for PhDs, and because of your area of expertise, you've got an access to that. But I think there's a reluctance in some ways. I noticed there was a reluctance to go there rather than to rely on experience. And I think one of the interesting things was that there's a guide, for example, which you showed people, which they could access. They could access the Australian Guide to...
So this was the research code for authorship.
To code for authorship. Yeah. And nobody knew about it. That is a really significant absence, I think, in Australian academic culture. But actually it was very obvious that people didn't know about it, and they hadn't really bothered to access it and didn't see the importance of it as a governance guide.
So what I did was I talked through this code in the flipped model, so in the video and in the podcast, and then I presented a scenario where a PhD student was very agitated and cross about authorship, about a principal supervisor taking authorship of their work that worked against the code. So that was a really powerful, you could see light bulbs going off in the room actually, where people were going, right, well, this is the code, I didn't know about this, and here's a student who does know the code complaining about this.
Right.
So that was quite powerful, where experience is beyond expertise. I think I remember you did a bit of my business in your group, because I think you said, how many of you have ever read this code before?
Yeah, they didn't know it. Until they came to that meeting, they'd never heard of it.
Isn't that?
And they may have accessed it very quickly in the part of the training, but actually, even then, they didn't really seem to see how significant it was.
So then they had their first experience of it in the video, and then because of the flip, it's then applied again and again, the old-fashioned spiral learning model.
Yep.
And when they apply it and walk around with it and talk it through, they suddenly realise how powerful and problematic this area is in doctoral education.
Yeah.
Very strong. You and I, we've already mentioned this slightly, obliquely if you will, that you and I have sat through some truly shocking supervisory training sessions around the world. My personal favourite involved being locked in an airless room with a man who was handling a hangover for 2 days straight, and really was pretty grumpy for the bulk of the day. You know exactly who I'm talking about. And we were left with this grumpy hungover man for 2 days, and he didn't like us, and at different points I thought he was going to be violent. But why do you think something that is so important is handled so incredibly badly in international higher education?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's because there has been this really strong move in globalisation towards the free market in higher education. And that's best seen, I think, in the areas of PhD supervision. So it's the last thing that anyone in the university or indeed in regulatory bodies wants to really regulate hard, wants to govern hard. And I think that's part of it. That's why there is so much difference in PhD supervision training around the world. And I think the thing that you've been able to do in your position as new Dean of Office of Graduate Research at Flinders is you've been able to bring in all of the best practice, all of the fantastic literature and the new ideas to change that. I think one of the reasons why people are reluctant to go to these things is because they think it's boring or it's not going to do them any good. But actually, you've been able to show how useful it is and how interesting it is.
Yeah. And it's the scholarship in it. I've always described the Dean of Graduate Research or the Dean of Graduate Students, however it's described, the Dean role in the graduate ed space. You know this. I've described it as the goalkeeper in the university. Every university only has one.
Yep.
And like a goalkeeper, say AC Milan, you very rarely see the goalkeeper. You very rarely see them. But when you do, they change the game.
Yeah.
So in classic Italian football, of course, you've got 0-0 very often. So you've then got penalties, and then the keeper really, really matters. So that's how I see this space is we should be invisible, this Dean role, most of the time. Yeah. But at the quality assurance moment where the rubber meets the road, to stop a very serious situation exploding, that's when the goalkeeper role, that's when the Dean of Graduate Research becomes visible.
Yeah.
I still think that metaphor works.
Yes, I think it does. It's a very good one. And that means that there has to be governance and regulation. Doesn't mean that it's light touch. It means that it's there, but it's in the background. And I think that's why there's the importance of supervisory training, so that people do really realise how much is involved in it and how much they can access the information.
Steve, thank you so much for this conversation, and also thank you so much for your intellectual generosity and also your leadership, because you didn't have to come to those trainings. There's plenty of people that with 10% of your experience go, no, I don't think so, and you made a decision to front and to be a part of the process, and you were so helpful with the early career academics and researchers. So I thank you for doing that, and I thank you for the commentary and the help you've given me since then.
I really enjoyed it. I think it was really practically important and theoretically useful, for all sorts of reasons.
For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.